It was very important for me to be a scientist, to follow the evidence. I very likely could have been swayed to start moving down that path because that would have been what I would consider doing the scientifically proper thing.
What are the mechanisms for change that the evolutionists would talk about?
Well, their primary mechanism is it's going to be mutation.
What about natural selection?
And the way that Darwin used it was it's a process. And a little bit of data and a lot of extrapolation, they proposed that we were only 1% different from chimpanzees. You'd think, well, what's the comparison of the human #1 chromosome with the chimpanzee #1 chromosome? But that's not how they do it.
Can you explain to us what is ENCODE and some of the background to ENCODE before we get into junk DNA?
Well, ENCODE is a consortium group.
They suspected was junk, therefore they didn't really research it all that clearly.
That's an excellent point.
And so all of a sudden now they're really researching it and they're finding all these medical possibilities.
So it really held back. They go with the less efficient one is designed and the more efficient one is not designed. See, that's not even rational.
It's a disconnect.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense. So part of what we're doing here by interviewing you and other scientists is that this needs to be directed to kids. It needs to somehow get into the public square.
Yes. Evolutionists have done a very good propaganda job.
We need to let people have an option.
Yes.
That there is design is an option, and that not design is a option.
And Christians need to stop being so gullible.
Beautiful, isn't it? These are just a few of the unique scenes found around Chino Valley, Arizona. I'm Jim Bendewald, the Executive Director for Evidence Press and your host for this program. I'm in the Van Andel Creation Research Center located in Chino Valley, Arizona. I'm here today to interview Dr. Kevin Anderson, who is the Director for the Research Center. Dr. Anderson has a PhD in microbiology, which means that he studies the intricate microtechnology built into cells. He's also a biology professor at a state university. So, Kevin, you have a story of how you became a creation scientist. I'd love to hear that story again.
When I first walked onto the college campuses, just out of high school, my goal was to go straight through to get a PhD in microbiology, which is, for the most part, what I did. But at that time, even though I was a Christian, and I certainly was very sympathetic and very appealed by or very drawn to the idea of creation, young earth creation, direct creation from God, I would have to admit that it was very important for me to be a scientist, to follow the evidence. And had I, through my college career, really encountered this overwhelming evidence that we're told exists for evolution, I very likely could have been swayed to start moving down that path because that would have been what I would consider doing the scientifically proper thing, objectively following the evidence. Because after all, God's not scared of objective evidence.
Mm-hmm. And you were open. That was your point.
Yeah, I was open. I'm not going to say I was 100% open, but I was certainly open because it was very important to me to be the scientist.
Okay.
As part of this journey, shall we say, I took 2 classes in evolution. This wasn't required for my degree. But I wanted to do it because I wanted to learn more about evolution. Not so much to see if I would become an evolutionist, but I wanted to understand it. What is that's the big attraction? And I got A's in both those classes, not suggesting, of course, that I was such a super great student, but just so you understand that I was paying attention. I understood that I was following what was being taught. And I very distinctly remember sitting at the end of the semester after finishing both those classes and sitting looking at my long pile of notes from both those classes and thinking, is this it? This is all they have? This is their big shot at a college level evolution class? And so, to need to say, I was very unimpressed. I did not find their arguments compelling. I did not find there was strength in their reasoning. And so I would say probably as much as anything, those two classes moved me to become a much stronger creationist because I felt I could interpret what they were arguing much better from a creation model.
So as you were gaining knowledge, the specifics of the biology was helping you
absolutely
to really identify what was really going on in the cell and
in a very big way.
Big
way. I would say when I finished my doctorate, actually received the sheepskin, I was a much, much stronger creationist than I'd ever been to begin with. So yes, the knowledge of the systems, the understanding of what was going on was very influential to me to move me toward creation and reject the arguments of the evolutionist.
Yeah, and I just find this to be so very powerful that I think that a lot of people will identify with it. That here's somebody that, you're coming from a science background, you're studying science, and it's the actual science that's bringing you to the point of design, of creation, and you're just,
Yes.
You're just encouraged by that evidence.
Yes. Granted, I was a Christian, so I was very willing to accept arguments of creation, but I found that even from a scientific perspective, they were much more valuable. They were much stronger. And I was very drawn to them as this makes sense. This explains it much better.
Excellent. All right. Good. Okay, Kevin, so I have this picture of a book from Amazon, What It Means to Be 98% Chimpanzee. So obviously this is a topic that has been going around among evolutionary circles, that there's a very close proximity between humans and chimps. And I know that you have a different view on that.
Quite a bit different view, yes.
So what's the news?
Well, I would call it the 1% myth. That really started back in a paper in 1975, before we really had much in the way of DNA sequencing. Some evolutionists, using our supposed evolutionary similarity to chimpanzee and a little bit of data and a lot of extrapolation, they proposed that we were only 1% different from chimpanzees. And so that really became the start of the 1% claim. And it started becoming popular because this fit an evolutionary concept. And as we find many times, if it fits an evolutionary concept, then it's kind of automatically taken, or shall we say it's at least taken far too easily. It's accepted far too easily. And this is one of those examples. Without much in the way of data, it must be right because evolution is right, so this must be right. And it really has been, shall we say, repeated and claimed and repeated for the last several decades. And even when the human DNA was finally sequenced in the early part of the 21st century, the claim was still being made, we're only 1% different, only 1% different. But now as they're doing
There's
a
some more
much more
backtracking.
careful job of comparing and of putting the sequences together, they're realizing, okay, it's not really 1% after all. And so now there's recognition, even the evolutionist community, that, okay, maybe 4, 5, 6%, but I think that's even being way too favorable. Let me explain just one thing. You would think, okay, if we're going to compare, say the human has 23 chromosomes, and they're all in pairs, so you have 46 total chromosomes. Okay, so you'd think, well, what's the comparison of the human number 1 chromosome with the chimpanzee number 1 chromosome? But that's not how they do it. They take the human number 1 chromosome and they search all of the chimpanzee chromosomes to see if they can find little bitty sequences that line up. Doesn't have to have anything to do with it being gene structures or regulatory structures, just little bitty sequences, and see if they line up. That's how they come about with their comparisons. So
but you were also saying that there's quite a bit of difference between just the percentage of genome for the chimpanzee and the human.
Correct. There's almost 12% more DNA in the chimpanzee chromosomes than there is in the human.
And so how can you only get a 1% difference when you have 12%?
You ignore the 12%. That's the way you do it. Now, I don't know if the chimpanzee appreciates you ignoring the 12%, because it probably is a little important to the chimpanzee. So that's why in 2010 there actually was a paper that finally did a comparison of all the techniques used to compare, you know, chimpanzee chromosome with human chromosome, with fish chromosome, with cow chromosome. And this paper concluded that they're so flawed in all the ways they do this that you get totally different results depending on what method you use and the assumptions of the method being used. And so the paper really suggested that we can't make a claim of what the similarity is. Now, I promise you there's still going to be claimed 1%, maybe 2%, but we know that you can't make really any claim at all. There's just no way at the moment to adequately compare.
When I first heard this story, from you, because I really hadn't heard it from other sources, it just really made me angry because it just seems so very deceptive. I mean, it's not a little bit deceptive. It's like, this is blatant, and they're sending this message out as proof or evidence for evolution, and it becomes like an icon of evolution.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's like, well, and now they start to backtrack, and so, okay, are they going to send out an apology, do you suppose? Are they going to actually admit that they were wrong previously?
Yeah, just like they've sent an apology for all the other things they were wrong about, yes.
I mean, this is just, I don't know if it's embarrassing for them, but it's anger-making for me.
It should be embarrassing because it shows how ready they were to jump to conclusions, how ready they were to accept false conclusions simply because they appeared to fit evolution without adequate data. So they should be embarrassed, but I don't think they will be too embarrassed, unfortunately.
Okay. So Kevin, Richard Dawkins is probably one of the most prominent promoters of evolution that I'm aware of, and he was a big promoter of junk DNA. Now since the ENCODE project, there was a whole slew of articles that were published last year from the ENCODE scientists. Can you explain to us what is ENCODE and some of the background to ENCODE before we get into junk DNA?
Well, ENCODE is a consortium group of, I don't even know how many, I mean, several dozen different scientists working to take a very, very small portion of the human chromosomes, the human genome, and analyze it in great detail to see exactly what it's doing, what's being made from it, what it looks like, what genetic content it contains, And they have, over the last several years, including, as you mentioned, a series of articles just last fall in 2012 that have been talking about this small segment of DNA in the human chromosomes and just how much it's doing. Instead of it being not much activity, it's a lot of activities, a lot of function, a lot of genetic events going on. And so, to their surprise even, they've had to conclude that it's not that most of the genome is not doing something, it's most of the genome is doing something.
And it's probably, you're probably even understating it, I would almost imagine. It sounds like there's these switching mechanisms going on, and as they continue to learn more, that there's just probably far more complexity happening than what they can just even imagine. And so previously they thought, oh, well, that just must be junk DNA left over from evolution.
There was one other thing I wanted to say about junk DNA, if we have a moment.
Go ahead.
I want to say that, junk DNA was also proposed as a very powerful argument against creation, because the creator wouldn't put just all this useless garbage DNA in there. You know, so yeah, it was supposed to be, it was your vestual organ version of DNA. You got little bits of pieces of what used to be our genes for gills or for fins when we were fish, and what used to be our genes for, you know, scales when we were lizards and such, and of course we don't use those anymore, so they're undergoing degradation, and so they're just residual junk sitting in there. And that was the assumption, that was the argument. And now that we're seeing that in fact they do have function, they do have value, see, what we have is a prediction made based upon evolution is wrong. And the creations have been saying all along, I'll bet they will have function after all, and we're right. Now you're going to hear evolutionists admit, score 1-0 for creationists? No, but that's exactly the case. The evolutionists were predicting based upon evolution, they were wrong. Creation predicting based on creation, we were right.
And also important along those same lines is this, because of this prediction that this mysterious material in the DNA they suspected was junk, therefore they didn't really research it all that clearly.
That's an excellent point.
And so all of a sudden now they're really researching it, and they're finding all these medical possibilities. So it really
held back not only genomics and genetics, but as you say, medical breakthroughs for probably at least a decade or two. Absolutely, because what's the reason of studying the junk? Who cares?
Who needs to study junk DNA?
So there's one of many examples where evolution really was a hindrance to the development of science. Had they followed the creationist, you know, prediction that it's going to have function, we should have been in there studying it as fast as we could, because we recognize this could be very vital too. Yeah, features of disease causing events and such, and absolutely that's what they're finding.
I want us to talk about the concept of the mitochondrial Eve. I think that there's some misinformation out there, as I've learned again from you and your presentation, and so I want us to talk about that. My own personal experience is I have a friend who was an old Earth creationist, and he wanted me to read this particular article on mitochondria and the mitochondrial Eve and how it favors an old Earth and old time scale, this sort of thing. So I would like you to explain what mitochondrial Eve is. Of course, you know, it has to do with DNA in the mitochondria and so on. So there it is. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, the mitochondria is an organelle. It's a little structure inside of our cells, but it actually contains a little bit of DNA. Like any DNA molecule, it's subject to mutations. It's subject to having its DNA sequence altered. Like any event in DNA where you have mutations occur, we can follow those mutations, at least in a limited manner, as far as what was the original sequence versus the sequence now. With mitochondrial Eve, this arose from some work done in the late 1980s where they began to recognize that we can take the sequences of the DNA in mitochondria of people living today, and we can start comparing them. You know, someone living here, someone living in Europe, someone living in Africa, someone living in Asia, and we can begin to compare them. And in that comparison, we can begin to see, well, what exactly are the differences in all of these family groups, people that are living apart from each other that presumably haven't interbred for a while. And they came to the conclusion that, in fact, they could track back and determine that there probably was one woman whose mitochondria is what we all now have. And she became known as mitochondrial Eve. Not out of respect of Eve of the Bible, it was a tongue-in-cheek joke. But the truth of the matter is, of course, now we can talk about Eve, you know, because it's in the scientific literature. Okay, so the idea was we're all descended from one woman, as the Bible says. So, yeah, very interesting. Now, what they did, though, was they said, yeah, but this woman lived, you know, some 150,000 years ago. So obviously, those of us, those of us that would be young Earth creationists, biblical creationists, will say, well, that doesn't fit our time frame, which is probably why your friend then would say, well, see, this disproves your position.
That's right.
And that was touted for a while, that the genetics, which is considered to be a very, you know, solid science, if you will. You know, you can't argue with genetics type thing. The genetics proves that Eve lived a long time ago, therefore, obviously, things aren't recent and young and such.
Right, so there's certain parts of science that is strictly historical and obviously very interpretive. Then you make interpretations based upon historical issues like fossils and that sort of thing. But now you're talking about genetics, and there you have mathematics and calculations and things. And so, well, there should be some objective data here.
Yes, and as a geneticist, I would tend to agree. I think we can be a little more objective than maybe geologists and paleontologists can be sometimes, you know, and because I think the way the data that we're able to work with is actually data from design. Even though that may not be the popular word that the evolutionists like to use, but because it's data from design, because DNA is designed, it's much more easy to interpret.
Okay.
Now, as far as the age of this mitochondrial Eve, we have to recognize that they put a fudge factor in, or shall I say an evolution factor.
Fudging again? Okay.
Yes, here we go again, exactly. Same song, third verse. What they did to determine the time frame between us of today and this Eve of the past was not, okay, what's the rate of DNA mutation of the mitochondria? Because if you simply just did that, which would obviously make the most sense of how to do it, but the problem is if you just did that, they come up with an age of 6,000 years. And that's published in a 1998 article in Science, where they admit it would only be 6,000 years. So obviously, that can't be right. You know, that just can't be right. So what they did in this publication, this initial publication back in the late 80s, was they assumed evolution. They assumed that we and chimpanzees had evolved from a common ancestor. And so instead of using the human mutation sequence of our mitochondria, which would only give the 6,000 years, they looked at the difference between human mitochondrial DNA and chimpanzee mitochondrial DNA. See? So they imposed an evolutionary interpretation into the data to give that time frame. So here we are again, imposing evolution into the interpretation, giving you an interpretation then that fits evolution.
You know, we're seeing this pattern over and over and over again. So as long as the evolutionists continue to assume that evolution is a fact, they can continue to provide evidence that supports their view.
Which makes total sense for them. And I'm not necessarily accusing them of an intentional falsehood. For them, it makes total sense because they are so convinced evolution is true that it makes sense to apply evolution to your interpretation.
But when I talk to people about this topic of creation evolution, it's one of the things that I like to try to point out to them is that so much of this data for evolution is based upon this assumption that evolution is true.
Especially in paleontology and geology and genetics, especially. And here's another example in genetics of where we impose an evolutionary interpretation, and that's how we draw our conclusion. But when it's being told to the public, that's not being explained that, well, this is based upon we assumed evolution in our interpretation. See, and so then when they're presenting like mitochondrial Eve, they're presenting it as evidence for evolution, even though evolution was an integral component of the interpretation. When you pull the evolution interpretation, the evolutionary component out of the interpretation, what do you get? 6,000 years. What's that sound like? Sounds very biblical, sounds very young Earth. That's the real data. My friend Ron Carter did some subsequent work where he has actually got where he feels he's within about 6 bases of knowing Eve's original mitochondrial sequence. So he thinks he's that close. So using his sequence data, it's even tighter that Eve was only about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. That's why you don't hear evolutionists talk much about mitochondrial Eve anymore, because it's excellent proof for, or excellent illustration of, a recent creation.
So again, they're backtracking.
To the point of even abandoning it.
So then likewise, mitochondria DNA, which was thought to be a huge, huge friend to the evolutionists, proving, I mean, just slam dunk. Just mathematically, like my friend. This is it. This is evidence for at least old Earth.
Yes.
And now we're seeing that really, if you look at the data, it's like, no, this is clear evidence for a young Earth.
Very clear. To the point, so clear, in fact, that to say you won't see evolutionists, knowledgeable evolutionists anyway, very much talk about mitochondrial Eve.
Now, you were also saying that some of these published articles are clearly stating this, that that it points to like 6,000 years, and then there's this extrapolation under the assumption of evolution. That's kind of what you were saying?
Yes, the 1998 Science paper, in fact, says specifically, if we don't put an evolutionary interpretation into the data, we come up 6,000 years. Now, this paper was not arguing for the need of a evolutionary extrapolation. It was arguing for, obviously, mitochondrial DNA can't be used as a molecular clock. That's what it was arguing. Why? Because it's 6,000 years. That can't be right, because we know evolution is true, and therefore you see the paradigm of evolution drives the interpretation of the data. And if the data doesn't fit evolution, then it must be wrong. There must be an error in it. And that's what that paper was about.
One other thing I wanted to talk to you about is DNA, and just the complexity of DNA and some of its structure and what it's doing. Could you explain?
Yes. There was a time in the 70s, 80s, 90s that we thought we pretty much understood DNA. We've got it down. We understand the basics of DNA. We understand the genetic language. So we're really getting a handle on this.
Okay.
And then you had the research come from the Human Genome Project, research come from other projects, and we began to see at a deeper level what is happening at the DNA molecule, and began to recognize that what we understood was really just the tip. It was really just the very beginning of it. We now recognize that DNA is so sophisticated and so complex in its interactings that we don't right now understand it. We only understand portions of it. We don't understand all of it.
And I just want to interject. I think a perfect example of that is the whole problem of junk DNA. That previously they thought, junk DNA in the human genome, that previously they thought like 98% was junk DNA. Now they're total reversal.
Because we now understand more what's going on at the DNA level, recognizing there was things going on we hadn't seen before. We didn't understand. You know, and sometimes you see it, but you don't understand it, so it's like it doesn't really count type thing. And so as we get studying, we recognize, oh, look at this, look what's going on. And then it's okay, why? I don't understand, we don't know. So we're really kind of where we don't now know the true genetic language, only portions of it. Let me give you an example. DNA is a three-dimensional molecule, meaning that it has, you know, the height, the breadth, the width. It's not just a linear line like letters on a page. It's a three-dimensional. But it's more than that. It changes with time. It expands, it moves. This strand moves over here. A strand from this chromosome comes over here and kind of interlinks with this strand. And so you have this whole dynamic, so it really becomes four-dimensional.
So are you saying that the chromosomes will work with each other?
Absolutely.
They're not completely independent.
Right. The chromosomes are not just packed up and just sitting there inertly. They are, and even within the chromosome, you have pieces of DNA that are packed in, but all of a sudden you have proteins pull them out so that they can be read, and then they're packed back in, and other strands are brought out and they're read. So even the single chromosome itself is very, very dynamic. But then you may pull out a strand from this chromosome, a strand from this chromosome, and link them around. See, so we have this, what I call it then the four-dimensionality, where at any given moment the actual three-dimensional orientation of the DNA has changed. So if we think of DNA as an information storage unit, this is an information storage unit that not only is in a three-dimensional structure, which would have any computer scientist just drooling to have a three-dimensional informational storage, but it's four-dimensional because the dynamic changes all the time. See, that technology is so beyond us. Let me use an analogy to explain that.
Okay.
It would be like taking a 2,000-page printed page copy of the book War and Peace.
All right.
And printing it in such a way that it's printed on 20 pages. Now, we're not talking about just making it very, very fine print. We're talking about normal print. But then you read that book by folding the pages across each other, by bringing portions of other pages in and folding it in and such, so that you have the entire War and Peace. It's all still a continuity. The entire War and Peace novel, but it's on those 20 pages if you know how to read it.
Well, it's more than just a book, isn't it? Because DNA is more, it's not just a written word.
I just use that as an analogy to show you as the informational storage. And so then the challenge is, can you read that book? I wouldn't know how to read that book. But then who could even write that book? We wouldn't even know how to write that book. Our technology today has no idea how to write such a book, and yet that book has been written. It's called your genome, your chromosomes. So who's the writer of that book? It has to be not some process that has no idea what it's doing and just throws things together and sees if it works or not, which would be what evolution is. It has to be an intelligence that is so great that we really don't even comprehend yet, and that would be the Creator God.
Amen. Yeah. So I guess what I was saying about the book is that it really almost like acts like an organism in itself, that the various pages are acting and reacting with themselves, whereas a regular page in a book, they're just
it's inert. It just sits there. Yeah.
Right. So you have all this stuff that's interacting. And
the book analogy is simple. Yeah, the DNA is even much more complicated than that. Because it being the way it's structured, it's not a just letters on a page. It is an entire dynamic. But that's also the reason that we only partly understand it now. When we thought we understood almost all of it, we're now backing up and saying, okay, we got a long ways to go before we understand it, because it's acting in ways we never even expected, let alone, are able to understand. Why is it doing that? We don't know. And so it's going to be years and years of analysis to really understand what the DNA is doing.
In the book Signature in the Cell from Stephen Meyer, one of the things that I gleaned from that book is he talks about inference to the best explanation. I get so perturbed by the evolutionists when they'll say, oh, you people, all you do is criticize evolution. You don't have any evidence. And I just see that is just so not true.
Yes.
But so I just love this idea or this concept of inference to the best explanation. So if you actually have two different options, you have design and you have evolution, or not design. I like to call it not design. So if you have two options, and then you look at the data, you look at the evidence, you go, which of these options does the evidence point to? And it's clearly design.
Yes.
But if you live in a world where there is no design option, all there is evolution, then you have to fit and cram and condense and force the evidence to fit that one view. That's why all the evidence fits evolution, because there is no option.
It doesn't really fit, but it is at least it's pretending to fit.
It's how it is presented. It's presented to the public that all the evidence does fit, and that it's a fact. And of course, what is the fact? Well, the fact that we change, that there is change.
Yeah.
And so, well, that's a fact.
We look at E. coli, the bacterium E. coli. There was a paper a couple years ago published that looked at the control system within E. coli versus the control systems of Linux. You know, Linux is your user platform similar to Windows. I suppose a lot of people would say Linux may be better than Windows, but anyway, what they were doing is looking at essentially the efficiency of the control system, how the program of Linux and the program in E. coli functioned. And what they found was that E. coli is dramatically more efficient in its controlling process than the Linux program. But the irony is, if you say to the evolutionists, which one of these do you know is designed, and which one of these are you saying is not designed, they go with the less efficient one is designed and the more efficient one is not designed. See, that's not even rational.
It's a disconnect.
Right.
It just doesn't make sense.
And it comes back to what you're saying. When design is not considered an option, we're forced to make what I call foolish conclusions.
So we've gone through a number of different evidences then that were previously thought to be evidence in favor of evolution, but really when you look at it and you take away the myth, that it's really evidence in favor of design. So what about our educational system? What about, are we at a stage where we can start talking about bringing this into schools, and what should we bring into schools?
First, I would just like to see the public school system, both secondary and at the college, university level, just simply become less hostile to the data that suggests, or the data that even illustrates, not only design, but even creation. Just simply become less hostile to the idea that evolution is not the answer, despite the lack of, explanation. It's even in some areas so hostile that a student cannot bring in an article. It might even be out of the Journal of Evolution, but they can't bring in an article that may contradict something that's in the lesson plan or something in the textbook. That's not education. That's indoctrination.
Right.
And when we do that, we're doing the student a terrible disservice.
And so part of what we're doing here by interviewing you and other scientists is to try to help educate the public, but also influence people so that and educators and parents and so on, that they begin to see the value of what we're talking about here. Is that this needs to be directed to kids. It needs to somehow get into the public square.
Yes. Evolutionists have done a very good propaganda job.
Campaign.
Yes. To where they've even been able to create almost a visceral gut reaction where anything that seems to hint at creation is just you just automatically, I won't even want to hear it type thing. And when you have that mindset, when you have that kind of mental conditioning, then there really is no proper conversation. You're really not at the table discussing things. It's already one-sided. We're the only side that can talk. You have to remain mute. And in any science setting, that's ridiculous. And we, in fact, think not only should we be able to speak, but we think we have a lot of things we can speak about. And evolutionists don't want you to hear them because, in all honesty, they're scared of them. It's not a matter of, well, it's just junk science and we don't want you to hear about it. We really can't answer a lot of these questions, and our answers are really very superficial. And so we don't want there to be a discussion, because when there's a discussion, evolution doesn't do very good.
Does this issue matter? That, it matters to kids. It matters because kids are, they're growing up. They've been going to church. After they've left the nest, they're going elsewhere. They're not going back to church, and we're seeing it.
Yes.
The statistics are very, very clear that there is a migration away from the church and towards secularism. It's just is very, very clear.
And when we look at the cause of that migration, it is because the kids were not taught how to answer fundamental questions that they're going to get challenged with by their other friends, by what they see on TV, by what they hear in the college classroom. See, university system has really been my life by and large, as far as going through receiving education, going through being a professor and such.
Right.
And so I'm very familiar with the university system, and I call it Satan's meat grinder.
Okay.
Because Satan is saying, come on, bring the little kiddies to me. You have not sufficiently rooted in the Word, and I'll chew them up because they're not ready. And so, unfortunately, when you have Christians that say, this isn't important, or this is too controversial, we don't want to get into this, what you're doing is you're abandoning the children. So when they come into Satan's meat grinder, they're not ready with answers. They don't know how to deal with all of this, of how this proves God didn't do it, this proves there is no God, this proves there is no creation, this proves the Bible's wrong. They're unprepared. You wouldn't send your child off somewhere for an over-week stay without preparing them. But yet go off to college, it's okay, you're not prepared, it's all right. Don't be surprised if when your child comes back, they're not the same person.
Very, very sad possibilities, yeah.
Yes.
It's a struggle for parents around the world, absolutely.
Yes.
So we need to provide tools and resources. That's what we're about. That's what Evidence Press is about. We're producing these short videos that anybody can use. So 2.5 minutes, 3.5 minutes, and they can put it on their iPhone or iPad, and so kids can be sharing it with other kids and so on. So that's part of the Evidence Press ministry and part of what we're doing. We need to let people have an option, that there is design is an option, and that not design is the other option.
And Christians need to stop being so gullible. They need to stop being so gullible. You have Mr. Atheist stand up there and denounce Christ and denounce this and denounce that about the Bible, and they're saying, oh, I'm not going to listen to that guy. And then all of a sudden, he denounces Genesis or denounces creation, and then they listen. Where did that come from? Why does he have some credibility? Why does he have something of value to say on the idea of creation when you reject what he says about everything else? How does that happen? And yet we see that time and time again, that Discovery Channel or National Geographic will be going on and on about, evolution, and they just suck it up. But then if they run a special about the unhistoricalness of Christ, I'll reject that.
But they have good pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, this has been a pleasure talking with you, Kevin. Just so
Thank
much
you.
Appreciate this time. So much appreciate just being here in Chino Valley, Arizona. Lovely, lovely weather and facilities. So it's just been such a joy. Thank you for kind of going through this together, and hopefully audience will appreciate it as well. But
It's been my pleasure.
it has really been good. It's just, you know, when I saw your program that you have, I saw those points, and it's just like, this just shouts as being true, and that people need to be aware of this information. So, absolutely, very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like you to kind of backtrack a little bit, and I know that some people in our audience are really not going to be all that familiar with even the common terms of evolution. Could you give kind of an explanation of what is evolution in maybe through an analogy so that the general public can understand what do evolutionists say evolution is?
Well, in the simplest term, evolution is just simply change.
Okay.
Now, obviously, immediately I have a problem with that, because then it's okay, what kind of change? Change in what manner? Change at what frequency? So there's all kinds of unknowns when you just say change. But by using such a loose definition, see, then you don't have to really defend much.
Well, at that stage, I'm an evolutionist.
Well, exactly.
Because, hey, there's change. And,
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
I recognize that there's change, and you have artificial selection, natural selection. So this is one of the things that bothers me too.
Yes.
That oftentimes evolutionists will say, well, evolution is just simply change over time, and evolution is a fact because there's
things
change over time.
Exactly.
But that's not what they mean when they say that
Right.
evolution is a fact.
Correct. Because they're not really talking about any change. See, creationists accept change. So they're not talking about any change. They're talking about the change that brings about what Darwin called descent with modification.
Right, right.
That is, that the fish at some point begins to move up onto land, develop legs, develop air-breathing respiration system, and become an amphibian, and the amphibian then transforms into a reptile. The reptile transforms into, some bird perhaps, and also into mammals. That's what they're talking about as far as change. They're talking about these very dramatic changes that are not just change in a color of fur or change in the placement of an eye. They're talking about a totally different organism, where the fish becomes an amphibian, the amphibian becomes a lizard, the lizard becomes a bird. Dramatic. That's what they're talking about.
Okay. And not to spend a lot of time on this, but let's just list what are the mechanisms for change that the evolutionists would talk about.
Well, their primary mechanism is it's going to be mutation in the DNA over time.
Right.
A lot of times,
that's another. Isn't that a mechanism? Is time a mechanism, or it's a factor?
They make time a mechanism. It's not really a mechanism any more than your car sitting in the garage for 20 years becomes a mechanism of how your car works. Okay, but they make it a mechanism because with time they can then kind of hide behind the idea that
there's a lot of fudging going on.
Oh
yes.
yeah, it's very hard to see these things happen because we don't see fish walking, on land, obviously. Well, it took a lot of time. So we put time in as kind of a fuzzing mechanism. And after all, given enough time, anything can happen, right? Everybody knows that.
That's right. So what about natural selection? Again, it's one of these terms that people are, I hear it so often, but I don't really get it. It's not very clear to them. So.
And in part, that's the evolutionists' fault because they use natural selection in so many different ways.
Okay.
I mean, the true correct way, and the way that Darwin used it, was it's a process. It's a process where a population is in a particular environment.
And it's a stepwise.
Right, be it hot or a cold environment or a wet or a dry environment.
Okay.
And that environment then causes the population to have to change, to adjust. Okay. That's the process aspect of natural selection. But evolution is also kind of applied to metaphysics, where it somehow has some spatial magic where it makes the organism become something, you know, or it has some kind of directing process where it almost actually sees ahead, even though evolutionists would deny that, of course, evolution cannot see ahead.
Yes, they wouldn't
but
say
yet
that.
you still see, you look in the literature all the time, it's like it must be seeing ahead. It's like it knew it was supposed to do this. Okay, so that becomes part of the confusion, is really how's it being used, how's it being referred to. But as a process, really, creationists don't have a problem with that, because we recognize that organisms adjust to the environment that they find themselves in. But we would state that that adjustment is by the means that God designed them to be able to adapt, to be able to adjust. He gave them the program to do that adjustment. If it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, the adjustment they make, you know, the beaks on the finches, Darwin's finches, those are pre-programmed. Those aren't mutations that are occurring out of nowhere that just so happen. Those are pre-programmed to adapt to the varying food sources that the finch has.
So we, as creationists, would agree that, or have this position, that God designed these with a great deal of genetic variability already built into the species.
Adaptability.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Another thing I wanted to mention about natural selection, I like the phrase survival of the fittest. Do you like that phrase? Do you think that that works? I mean, as far as what is observed?
I think, again, it's overplayed, because the fittest don't always survive. So it's
they don't always, but it's kind of
a
percentage game, I suppose.
And it also becomes, that's true, but it also becomes a bit of a circular definition, because how do you define survival of the fittest? Well, it's the most fit survive. Okay, how do you determine they're fit? Well, if they survive. If they survive, they're the most fit, you see. So it's kind of hard to put a precise definition to. And so, again, fitting within that very loose definition of evolution. And I say it's kind of like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. You know, you just can't get things pinned down very clearly. And any model, any scientific claim that says that it can account for everything that evolution says it can account for needs to be much more precise and much more tight in their definitions and terminologies, and not relying on hiding behind vagueness.
It would be nice if they came to be more clear to the public, defining their words as they explain things.
But there's a reason that they don't, because they know the moment they do. They know the moment that they define very precisely what evolution is, very precisely what survival of the fittest is, or even what natural selection is, then they have an actual spot they have to defend. And they don't want to defend it because it would be next to impossible to defend. So keep it very broad, then you have to worry about defending any one particular place.
Okay, but an evolutionist would say, they would turn the tables and say, well, that's what a creationist does. They don't clearly define what creationism is, or the whole idea of a kind. What is a kind? I would like you to take a few minutes and explain what is creation? What is a creationist point of view when it comes to God creating?
The model that I would support, the model that I'd say makes the most scientific sense to me, is that you have the God of the Bible, which certainly makes the most scientific sense to me. It would be the God of the Bible, not some UFO alien, not some deity that walks away and doesn't care about his creation. The God of the Bible, that he specifically created, as in from nothing, made the universe, made stars, made earth, made moons. Okay? And then from that, he also then specifically created, as he says in Genesis, the earth brought forth plants. The waters brought forth marine creatures. So what you have is there was a time there wasn't plants, and then there was plants. God created them. There was a time there wasn't fish in the sea, then there was fish in the sea. God created them. So it wasn't a matter of a slow process where he started out with a few cells and they kind of, by his constantly fiddling with them, finally got a fish. Okay, that's not quite what I want. Let's work a little bit more. Okay, not, in other words, like God's tinkering around trying to figure out what he wants.
Right.
Okay, so you have then fully formed whales, fully formed sharks, fully formed goldfish, fully formed oak trees.
Okay. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about kinds. How can we know what is a kind?
Classification is very difficult. Certainly within the standard classification of phylum, order, family, genus, species, very difficult to apply those simply because of the diversity and the breadth of biology. Very hard to make determinations of where to draw the lines. Species are very, very difficult to determine if species A and species B are different or the same, and you have a lot of different opinions. Really, when it comes to classification, it literally is put five classification experts in the same room and you get 7 different classifications. They really aren't going to agree very well. So even within kinds, we run the same problem. It's very hard to define exactly where you draw the line of one kind or another kind.
But that is also true for species.
It's even more so true for species. Absolutely.
And that's one of the they'll say, oh, the smoke, throw up all this smoke about, well, you can't define kinds. Well, you can't really define species.
Correct. Cannot.
And there is a lot of similarity. I think sometimes there might be some equal.
I would say that occasionally, but it's very rare that kind would probably be equivalent to very many of contemporary species. So there's sometimes the accusation that we as creationists believe in what's called fixity of species, that each species is the actual created kind. And I don't know of any creationist geneticist that accepts that.
Okay. Well, talk a little bit, why is the concept of kind important? Why do we talk about it?
Well, of course, first off, because biblically, God identifies using his classification scheme, which he's not obligated to conform to our classification scheme. Okay. Using his classification scheme, he created organisms differentiated or boundaried by what he called kinds. And kinds don't change. Now, within the kind, we apparently see quite a bit of change, but kinds don't change, which means that it's very clear fish are a different kind than amphibian. The frog and the goldfish are 2 different kinds. So the goldfish did not become a frog.
Okay.
Both biblically and scientifically, I say there's not a shred of evidence to suggest that happened. Okay, so kind becomes important in that regard. But we also know enough about kinds. For example, we know that tigers and lions can actually reproduce. You get a liger. Okay. So that would seem to suggest they're probably the same created kind. Now, what that actually looked like, we don't know. Because they have since separated. So as a creationist, I have no problem with speciation, which always throws evolution because they assume speciation means evolution, which it doesn't really.
Right.
Okay. There was apparently a lot of speciation early after the creation, particularly, I would say, after the flood. Very little speciation occurring today.
Okay.
Now, but most speciation is a removing of. The lion and the tiger are 2 different species of what appear to be the same created kind, not because one evolved from the other, but because they both separated genetically. So they took part of the original genetics with them. So speciation is a separation or a division or removal of, not a process giving you evolutionary common descent. Completely opposite direction.
But I just think of it also in relation to like Noah and the ark, and that when you're talking about kinds, that Noah did not need to have each species of animal, but he needed to have each of the kinds. And so the kinds are a broader category than species, I would say probably predominantly so. And that's a significant factor.
Absolutely, right. So suddenly the ark is not full. In fact, there was probably plenty of room on the ark with room left over.
Okay, all right. And regarding theology, the theology of, you and I are both young earth creationists. There's scientific reasons for that. I have a whole paper from Dr. Russell Humphreys on evidence for a young earth, and there's I know that there's a variety of scientists that support a young earth. There's lots of scientific evidence, but there's also theological rationale for why this is important. why a young Earth system is important. Can you explain that? Having to do with the fall?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. At the end of creation, God pronounced everything very good.
Okay.
So I have a very difficult time seeing how God could have made that pronunciation if there had already been millions of years of death and decay and entire extinctions of species and such. Plus, when did human become human? You know, God declared it very good only when he finally zapped two little creatures and said, I'm going to now make you human, but they had been dying all along too. So we see death of all the biological systems, not just animals, but even what became human, even what were human too, were dying. So now what we have theologically is the separation of death from sin. And yet we see in the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome, where he draws the very tight connection that death came into the world because of Adam's sin. Well, if Adam wasn't a historical person, if God really didn't create Adam, and Adam really didn't introduce the first sin, which led to the first death, then what sense does it make what Paul's talking about?
But it's more than that. It's more than just death. I
Sure.
think that it has to do with the problem of evil. It has to do with why do we have cancer? Why do we have all these problems and the murders, you know, and all kinds of illness? Well, it has to do with the fall, with the fall of Adam and the curse
because
or
with
the pronouncement.
With the fall, then death came in, and with death, then now you have disease. Now you have those events that are going to occur in your body. Now you have murder. Now you have evil actions that are occurring now in that post-fall, that sinful world. Now, was there no murder prior to this moment that God, declared everything very good that had been going on for millions and millions of years? There was no murder, there was no death, there was no evil of any kind, there was no pathogenic bacteria killing people, giving people and animals cancer and such. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So I would say they have a huge problem trying to explain all of that theologically as well as just philosophically within a very old earth model, and yet have a God that is a loving, caring, merciful God who apparently is the source and the cause of all of this, because he must have made it. That's where it must have come from.
Right. So it just totally makes sense to just simply follow the Bible for how it naturally reads. It really does make sense.
Absolutely.